Welcome, everybody, to Integrate Yourself. I'm your host, Allison Pillow, and you can find me at pureenergypdx.com. Today, I am here with a very special guest. Ryan, how do you say your last name? Hold on, let me before I go there.
Sprague.
Sprague. Okay, thank you. I just want to make
Yes.
sure I pronounce it properly.
Yeah.
Today, I am here with a very special guest, Ryan Sprague. Ryan is the founder and co-owner of Highly Optimized. Highly Optimized is a company dedicated to helping its clients transform and become the conscious leaders the world is patiently awaiting. He is also the host of the Highly Optimized podcast, the This One Time on Psychedelics podcast, and is the co-creator of the Connect with Cannabis program. Ryan's mission in life is helping his fellow brothers and sisters become empowered in their experience of being alive through one-on-one men's coaching, plant medicine integration coaching, and retreat experiences. He has a background in psychology, natural organic farming, health and fitness, and spirituality, and combines these fields to create a holistic approach to physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being in his own life and the lives of those he works with. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Allison. It's so amazing to be here. We were talking before we hit record. I always really love podcasting with other podcasters because I feel like we understand dialogue. We understand how to ask questions. It's so much fun. So I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been wanting you on my show for some time now. We connected through many different people, but I think the first time I connected with you is through the Unlifted coaching program with Alex Morningstar. And you
Yes.
work with him in your Connect with Cannabis program as well,
Mhm.
which I'm excited to hear more about.
Yes.
I'll share with everybody that, when you talk about, um, and I'm a new Volcano owner, and I'm really enjoying it. It's a vape. It's the highest quality vaporizer I think I've ever used. I just want to share with you. I'm really excited to learn more about all of this too, and how we
Yes.
can do this more in a healthy way, because there's actually a lot of health professionals in our circle that are using it too, and it's a different way of like bringing it in, like herbs, as opposed to like a tea or something, or a different way you would do that. So welcome again, Ryan, and please share with my audience whatever you'd like to share about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Mentioning the volcano, which I'll touch on first, what a lot of people don't realize is that, humans have been interacting with herbs, whether through smoking or vaporizing means, since really the dawn of time. I mean, the first, remnants of smoking goes back, over 10,000 years. And, vaporizing, in my research with cannabis specifically, goes back to the age of the Scythians, right? Where they would instruct or, construct these makeshift teepees, and they would throw hot stones in the middle of it, and they would just literally dump piles of cannabis onto it and sit inside of it, right? And
Wow.
they'd all be howling with laughter, right? So, it's funny that, and I'm like, wow, that's really aggressive, guys,
Yeah.
and they like to party apparently, but it's like, I think a lot of us have been, I know I was anyway, I'll speak personally, conditioned to believe that, specifically with cannabis, and we'll get to tobacco as well, but these things are kind of like on the fringe, right? And if you do these things, you're one of the few, right? And you're going to rot your brain, and all of these ridiculous claims that people have come up with. And it's really great that we live in a time now where we actually do have quantifiable science coming out to attest to these claims that people have been making for really hundreds of years now about cannabis, about tobacco, about all the different herbs on the market, right? And so, really my story, it ropes really into my cannabis story too. It's kind of, one of the same. My origin story, if you will, is, growing up, I never liked alcohol. A lot of friends, when you're 16, 17, are starting to drink. And what I realized was, even though that was the trend, it wasn't working for me. And this, caused its own little dark night of the soul, right? And
Mhm.
I'm like, how do I fit in? All these things. And around that same time, I started, experiencing some symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. And so, as fate would have it, I ended up interacting with cannabis one time, thought it was the devil's lettuce and all this stuff, but I tried it, right?
Haven't
Whether you want to
heard
call
that
it,
one.
yeah, yeah. I like pulling out these names, because they're really comical, right? But at one
Yeah.
time, people really believed these things. And, I imagine, I mean, it's a big world. Some people still do. And so hopefully, the conversation we have today can illuminate some of these new researches and, some of these new findings on people. But, around this time, I started interacting with cannabis, and I realized that although it was, psychedelic for me at that point for sure, and we'll get into how cannabis is to people psychedelic, but, you know, what I started realizing was, oh, it's interesting, like, yeah, I may not be able to drive a car or do a lot of the things that society says are functional, right? Like, but albeit, I'm having reduced symptoms of anxiety, right? Like, and I'm almost having this like, I don't care what anyone thinks type thing, right? And then also at the same time having like I don't even know what I think. How do I know what I think? And all these interesting things that came along with it, right?
Yeah.
So cannabis was really my introduction to questioning everything, right? Because I realized the first time I interacted with cannabis, and again, this is at a young age, but I realized that, well, I definitely didn't know anything, right? And I think that that was a great, intro into that, because what I've come to realize, in the modern day, which we'll get to, I'm sure too, is that, wise is the man who knows he does not know, man or woman, right? And when you enact imagination, right, which I believe is the truest human superpower of them all,
Mhm.
you realize that we have 7.5 billion plus different realities in this world. And so, you know, to say we know anything objectively is pretty silly, right? And it's almost
Yeah.
naive, right? And so that was my introduction to it. And, as time went on, this is about a year later, I had my first mortality crisis, right? Where I went to the bathroom and I peed blood and I was like, what's going on,
Oh
right? Thought I
gosh.
was dying, all of this stuff. And, at that point, I was, I wasn't the healthiest 18-year-old, right? Big shocker there, right? I was smoking cigarettes. I was, eating fast food. I was doing all the things, right? And so,
Right.
whether or not any of those things actually interplayed into this, which was a benign cyst on my kidney, thank goodness. Through that time, my father and mother, but my father specifically had kind of known what I was doing. My mom knew I would tell her. I always felt safe to tell her, but my dad was a little more straight laced, right? And so when we're going to the hospital, he's driving me there and he's like, listen, I got to know, are you doing drugs? And I was like, no, but I am interacting with a lot of cannabis. And I saw him go, like that, like he was relieved. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Right. And so we get to the hospital and he stays with me for the 4 days I was there. Right. Cause I was like, a wreck. And, I'm not afraid to admit it. But, during that time, I had my laptop there. So him and I started watching a lot of the things that I had been watching to do with cannabis. Right. There was a documentary out of that time called Leaf with Dr. William Courtney. And at that time, his patient, I forget her name offhand, but she ended up becoming his wife after this, which is a pretty cool story. But he found her when she had like 10 plus autoimmune disorders, right? She
Oh
was
wow.
absolutely a mess. And so he basically prescribed THCA, which is THC in its raw form, which you get from juicing cannabis, right? So
Oh
it's not
wow.
psychoactive. And what he found was that all of her like symptoms went into remission. Every single disorder she had, everything went into remission. And so they made this documentary called Leaf. It's really, cute and nice, and it has a lot of great information in there too and research. But to my dad's credit, he was like, wow, I guess I was wrong, right? Because he grew up in the 60s and he had tried it, and things, and he wasn't like,
Mhm.
vehemently against it or anything. But, he was kind of just like, hey, people would do this, XYZ had his programs. But then he looked at me and he was like, well, you're getting straight A's in school. You know what you want to do with your life, right? At least you're going to school for psychology at that time. And he's like, well, I mean, you're an adult. If this seems to be working for you and you're able to stay off pharmaceuticals and, things that he had also known caused some challenge with a lot of people that interact with him. He's like, you know what? I'm for that. And to add on to that, he was like, well, I'd rather you do it in the house, right? Because at that time I was living with them. And so, after that, it was really great because I realized that luckily my parents had always been pretty open. They were never like, don't do this, don't do that. They were kind of just like, they would give me guidance if I asked. But what I realized was once I got permission to do that, it completely did away with any amount of wanting to overuse cannabis, because I wasn't so worried about having to go out and get all my, my cannabis smoking in, or my cannabis use in, when I was not at the house, and then come back and be able to reintegrate. So, I started at that time really interacting with cannabis as a medicine. And so at that time I was daily using, and, all the things, and we can definitely get into that wormhole. But, what I realized was at that same time, my dad was going through a challenge, and the recession had, just hit. This is like, 2009, 2010. And a business that he owned that was doing really well before the recession pretty much got like plummeled, right? It got pummeled by it. And
Talking about
so
2008.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, he was facing a dark night of the soul of his own, and he needed a good hobby, right? And so, me at this time, I had gotten into school for cannabis training. There was a school that came around in my area that specialized in cannabis training, but it was a holistic health education center. And so, this guy, Mike Fitzgerald, and his wife, Melissa, they taught me so much stuff. They were all deadheads from Maine, and they really understood the many facets of cannabis, right? To do with the science, right? Like the growing, the history, all the medical science out of that time, the endocannabinoid system, how it works in the body, all of these types of things. So, I went deep down the rabbit hole. So I'm going to school for psychology and that at the same time, because I knew that with the typical psychology paradigm, I didn't want to be wearing khakis for the rest of my life in an office building, right? So I was like, I'm not going to be a therapist, right? But I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so, my father supported me and actually paid for me to go to this cannabis school, because at that time I was a broke college student, right? And so he ended up coming with me a lot, and learning a lot himself. And so around that same time, I was like, Dad, cannabis had become legal medically here. I had my medical card, and it was legal to grow a couple plants. So I was like, Dad, this would be great for both of us. We can start a hobby. I don't have to, look for cannabis and spend money. I can grow it myself. And so after some convincing, he was like, all right, let's do it. So we started growing, and our first harvest was terrible. I mean, it was absolutely garbage, right? And around, that was right before I started the cannabis school. So, once I started going to cannabis school, I started learning a lot about organic soil science, regenerative agriculture, all of these things, and the dangers of chemical salt nutrients, all of this type of stuff that we know in the general gardening world. And around this time, I hadn't interacted with any other medicine as of yet. It was just cannabis. I mean, I was like still deathly afraid of any other thing. I thought, mushrooms, you do them 3 times, you're going to be insane, all these things, right? So I was still very much in my programming. And so I went to EDC Las Vegas, which is a gigantic music festival, like 300 something thousand people over 4 days go there. It's insane, right? And so I had been in the club scene for a while now. I had seen plenty of people interact with, what they at least thought was MDMA. I have no idea. And from the effects of what I know what to do now and what they were experiencing, I don't think it was. And that was part of the reason that I didn't want to. I was like, I'm not against it. Like, this is what I was thinking at that time, but I'm like, it's not going to be a decision I make when I'm, at a club and someone gives me their finger with crystals on it. It's like, lick this off. Like, not the way I want to do it. Right. Like, I'll take things I don't want to do for 500, please. And so, so I went to EDC Las Vegas, and I was with some very trusted friends, and they found a source there for some MDMA. They tested it. They were like, it's great. I was like, okay. So I tried it, and I experienced the heart opening effects of it. And during that time, I felt this specific feeling, and, I can't really put it into words. It was just a very intense pain in my heart. Right. And for some reason, it kept getting linked to my dad. Right. And at this time, I didn't understand intuition like I do now and things like that, but I just kept wanting to text him. And so I was like, that's interesting. And so I come home, and I'm reintegrating the normal life. And 9 days after I get back, my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so, yeah, so during the time I was at the cannabis school, which I still was at that point, I had learned and seen firsthand with my own eyes people that were curing their cancer with the help of cannabis. And so if anyone listening is like, what are you talking about? Look up Rick Simpson oil, aka Phoenix Tears, or it's like objective name FICO, full extract cannabis oil. And there's many studies out. I know, because I just did all the research for the Connect with Cannabis Science program. And, there's a lot of research out there showing that THC can kill cancer cells and CBD can inhibit its growth. And cannabis works in this synergistic manner to really accentuate health. And so, my father and I took our grow that we were, doing at that time, a couple of plants, and I made it all into FICO for him. And, I didn't know at the time, but he was only supposed to make it 3 months from when they found the cancer. And my dad wasn't the healthiest guy, right? So he told me, he's like, listen, I'm not going to stop smoking cigarettes. I'm not going to stop eating subs. I'm not going to stop drinking Coca-Cola, right? And I was like, okay, I'm going to love you for who you are, right? And so he also decided not to do chemotherapy or radiation. So I decided, like, okay, I'm going to give him this FICO and just, hey, we're going to enjoy the last time we have together. Right. And fingers crossed, hopefully it works. Right. And he gets an extended amount of life. And so for someone who was only supposed to make it 3 months, he ended up making it 11 months, and he had his dignity that whole time. Right. Wow. So he was himself up until the day he wasn't. And we got to share so many experiences together. I mean, Thanksgiving, the holidays, his birthday, my birthday, so many things that otherwise might not have ever happened. We don't know for sure, but might not have ever happened if it weren't for cannabis. And so it was through that experience that I really deepened my relationship to the plant and realized that this was much more than just something I used to relieve my anxiety. Like there was specific messages coming to me from cannabis, and there was a very intimate relationship I was building with it. And so, from there, that was when I was 23. And, like I said, medical had passed, but there was really no plan for dispensaries. And so, we'll fast forward a couple of years, dispensaries start opening. I start hounding the one near my house. And finally, I call so much with the owner, sweetheart of a guy, which is really rare to find in the world of cannabis, because most people that own these companies, ran from cannabis their whole life, didn't inhale in high school, and it's just their new thing to make money on. So this guy was like, yeah, and that's another rabbit hole we can go down. But, this guy was like, listen, you're persistent. I'm going to put you in touch with the hiring manager right now. So I go in for an interview, got the job on the spot. The guy, like, it was so awesome. Like it was really what you'd expect the dispensary to be. The guy that interviewed me, now a great buddy of mine, they all came from the food service industry, and they were like, yeah, we're sick of real life. Like this is our Mexico, essentially. Right. Like this is our, like, we're going to live life on our own terms. And so, it was a smaller company. It wasn't corporate owned. And, I had a blast. I worked there for 5 years. I met with over 9,000 patients as a patient care advocate. I worked in cultivation. I worked in processing. I mean, I did literally everything, because when we first started, they didn't have the money to hire enough people. Right. And so, they treated us really well. And so we helped them out with anything they needed. And, so I thought, great, I'm going to be a lead cultivator. I was having interviews at different places. And then I started realizing that something wasn't right. And what started happening was our company got bought out by a like super cringeworthy company. I still remember the day the guy came in, like I don't know if he was the hiring guy, whatever, general manager. He came in and he was just like giving the sales pitch. And all of us were like, listen, that we actually interact with this plant, right? We know how to tell when someone's lying. Like it was kind of just awkward and embarrassing for him. And so, cause he had come from like Lowe's or Home Depot or something, it was just like weird. And so, I started realizing like this started happening to a lot of different companies, and a couple of the ones I was talking to, were kind of the same thing. And so I had been so, geared towards like, well, I'm getting this position and it's awesome, that I hadn't really stopped to think about like, how does my heart feel about this? Right. And so I had a dark night of the soul again. And this brings us up to a couple of years ago. And, there was a certain point where I went to Las Vegas for MJ BizCon, which is like the biggest cannabis convention. My girlfriend, Rachel, and my buddy, Devin, who we're all like cannabis entrepreneurs, right? We've always wanted to own our own places and do our own things. We went out there to find our own investor. That was our deal. We don't need these people. We can do it ourselves. We went out there and it was just much more of the same, right? It was like, everyone's like, how many grams per square foot can you get? And I'm like, well, do you care what quality is? Nope. Only how much you can give me. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Right. So they wanted me to grow with chemical salt nutrients and all these things. And so I came back and, I had another plant medicine ceremony out there where, once again, I had realized a big thing that I didn't know until I knew it, which was that I was abusing cannabis, right? And I was using it daily, and I was numbing out my emotions using it unconsciously. And so I quit for 3 months. And during that time, started Highly Optimized, started the podcast, had no idea what I was doing, but just knew that my heart was in it. And, over the next year, the pandemic happened, obviously, and I decided to wing it and traveled the most I've ever traveled. Ended up, started it at Mark's Lake House down in Virginia.
Yeah.
And then, from there, met Chris Marhefka. He's like, hey, we're doing a men's retreat in a week. You want to come in Colorado? I'm like, yeah. So I signed up for that. And then from there, Danny Rios was like, hey, I'm going to Mexico for 6 weeks. You want to come? I'm like, yeah. So I went to Mexico. I mean, it's just been that ever since. And that brings us up to the present day. So that's my
Wow.
origin story. Yeah.
That's amazing, man. You and what an incredible story that brought you here, especially the story about you and your dad and how it helped him. And so I can see how cannabis is really close to your heart.
Mm.
Um, eh, when you felt like you were abusing it too much, did you then come back to it in a different way and had a different relationship with it after that?
Yeah.
And when was that? Was that during the pandemic or? Yeah.
Yeah. So I love this question because it's so powerful because for a lot of people listening, what I want to get across is that with cannabis, there is no right or wrong answer, right? Like there is individual experience. And so for me, I was the epitome of health. I still am, right? I love health stuff. I love fitness. I love all these things. And I was only interacting with cannabis once per night. I was vaporizing. I had all the reasons in my head that I was doing it. I was telling people all day, and again, no judgment. I just knew it wasn't for me. And so when I came back, this was right around like the first week of December. I decided that, my soul had a really interesting conversation with me where it was like, you really want to know who you are? Like, stop interacting with cannabis for a while. Right.
Mhm.
And so I bought the ticket and took that ride and quit for 3 months. And I had no cannabis during that time. I had no nothing. I very rarely drink caffeine, but like I was telling you before we hit record, another medicine I like is kratom, especially for podcasts. I did nothing. Like I didn't have any
Is it
cacao. I had
kratom?
nothing.
Kratom?
Yeah, kratom.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've always said it kratom, but people were like, it's actually pronounced kratom. So now I've
Oh,
fallen into that, but
yeah. I've
yeah,
never heard
kratom.
it
Yeah. Yeah,
pronounced the
exactly.
other
We're
way.
American. We can call it what it is in America, kratom.
Kratom.
So yeah. And so, I abstained from everything during that time. And I really connected to my heart again, and everything came back online. Like I always like to use the analogy of if you've ever seen Independence Day,
Hmm.
where they go to Area 51 when the shit's hitting the fan, and they go down there, and the president's like, "How's it going?" And he's all like, like really like rigid, and the scientist guy with the long gray hair, he's like, "Oh man, it's amazing! All these buttons are turning on, right?" And he's like, "What the hell, man? Like the world's ending, right?" But that's how I felt. It was like, I'm like, whoa, like all these new things are turning on. And so I knew that through this time, cannabis was still speaking to me, right? And that was my first, like, interesting. Like, I don't need to interact with the plant for it to have a voice in me, right? And it was kind of like, no, right? When you choose to really apprentice with this plant, and this is something I've researched in what I teach and connect with cannabis now as well, is that when you apprentice with this plant, it's inside of you, right? Like it's in you, it's part of your being, right? Because you've become devoted to it, right? It's the same thing as if you're a Christian, right? Let's use religion for an example. The idea anyway is that you don't need to go to church to find God because God is within you, right? Now,
Yeah.
personally, what I believe is that we're all God and God is within you no matter what you believe, but that's another whole, rabbit hole. But after these 3 months, I started interacting with cannabis again. And what I found worked really well for me, and I've stuck to ever since, is I interact with cannabis on Friday nights, Saturday nights, and sometimes Sunday nights. And I abstain from cannabis in all forms the other days. And what I realized was my pattern was that I was numbing out emotions from with cannabis. Right now, that wasn't cannabis's fault. Right, that was my unconscious pattern, and I take full responsibility for it. But what I realized was if I go through the most, quote unquote, challenging and stressful periods of my week, right, where my masculine energy really has to be forthright, which is during like my work week, right, like with doing podcasts, with coaching the program, those are when all those emotions come up that I'm ultimately going to want to fall into the unconscious pattern of hiding. So
Hmm.
what I realized was by not interacting with cannabis, I could make sure I really handled my stuff, and I could journal during that time of like, okay, this is where I'm getting stuck. Okay, there's this trigger. Okay, and then by the time I go sit with cannabis, I do so intentionally. We can get into like the ritualistic process I go through, but by that time I have a whole list of questions, things that I'm actually seeking, right? And then cannabis is like, oh, that's the direction you want? Yeah, I'll show you that, right? And
Right.
then in that experience or those experiences, I then integrate that. Ooh, okay, presence feels like this. This is what makes me feel present, right? So then the next week, say when that challenge with presence comes up, I go, oh, I know playing guitar makes me feel like that. So then I can go play guitar. And in
Mm-hmm.
that way, cannabis is a plant teacher for me, and this is like what I'm teaching people is that, listen, you can smoke all day, every day if you want, right? If it's working for you. But let's be honest, is it working? If it was really working, would you need, unless you're in serious pain or you have cancer, if it was working for your mental conditions, would you need it all the time? Right. Like, and it's no one's quote unquote fault, right? We've never gotten the user manual for this plant, right? There's information out there on psilocybin, on LSD, on ayahuasca, right? But where's the information on cannabis, the most readily available like plant for people to interact with psychedelically? And so it's a really interesting rabbit hole, but that's really how I reintegrated it into my life. And it's having that dieta is what I call it, every week, where I take those 4.5, 5 days off, depending on if I interact Friday night or Sunday night, you know has really helped me remember what I love about cannabis, because then when she's not in my life, I go, oh, I really missed that aspect of her. So then I know more of what to set the intention for. Like for me, it's relaxation, right? So,
Yeah.
and creativity. So like sometimes if I don't necessarily have a big, huge question, but I know I need to relax, I'll be like, cannabis, remind me what relaxation feels like. And then I'll be like, oh my goodness, yes, this is what it feels like. And so it's similar to how they say absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? Like in our times of absence from a romantic partner, from our friends, from our business, we actually realize what they do for us and what they give to us and what they allow us to open up within ourselves. And so, like I always say, the name of the game is simply awareness, at least in my life. It's no right or wrong. It's just like, hey, I just want to become more aware each and every day of who I am, what my purpose is, why I'm here, what the things I like for, what the people in my life do for me. All of those things allow us to remember what love truly is. And the paradox in that is that I believe we are just pure unconditional love embodied in the physical form. So it's knowing thyself in the in the broadest of definitions, but also in the most incredible experiences.
Yeah, I love that so much, Ryan. I've never heard anybody explain cannabis that way before, and that
Mm,
makes so much sense to me because my interaction with cannabis in the past, it has been my teacher. I don't do a lot of drugs. I tend
mm,
to, have a glass of wine and a little bit here and
mm,
there. And usually I'll go into uh, more of those kinds of states, like in emotional coaching intensives
mm,
and other things, dance and breath work and stuff like
mm,
that. But what I learned, and actually this is during the time of the Oregon Festival, and I think I was out. We were out at
mm,
that farm and camping and stuff, and I realized that there's a paranoia. I know it's pretty normal for people to get paranoid sometimes when they're on
mm.
cannabis,
Yeah.
but for me, I was like, but why? Why am I feeling like paranoid about like people seeing me? Like why am I worried about like saying something? So what I came to the conclusion, and this was actually around Alex too. I was like, because I look at Alex, Alex is he's a mutual friend of you and I's,
Yeah.
and you work with him, and he's just like the most like loving soul I've ever
Yes.
met. And he just doesn't have any real judgment. Neither does Jody for that, his partner. And
Yeah.
so it's like, I'm like around him very, they gave me the vaporizer one night and I said, I made the mistake of like taking some before I asked what was in it. And then
Yeah.
like, I was like, did this have cannabis in it? Oh yeah. I was like, oh, so I knew I was like I'm really sensitive to it. I'm really
Mm,
sensitive to most any drug. And so it doesn't take much for me. But I started like um kind of seeing myself in a different way um with it, like at first I've in the past I've gotten like kind of anxious at like I start to let go and then I get anxious and I'm like,
Mm,
what, where's this coming from? And it's because I'm losing myself. I'm losing what I perceive as me or
yes.
my ego, right? And I started to see that after a while and I was just like, oh, and so as I've like been able to actually use that plant medicine in my waking state,
Mm,
and I've been able to bury a lot of my old identities and how I want people to see me or experience me, or how how other people have, experienced me, or what I've identified with. It's actually been a little bit easier to be with cannabis now on occasion, because like I'm like, wow, this is actually, now I can really let go and relax because I'm not really worried about, you know, like exposing myself, to, because like I don't need those identities
mm.
anymore, So it's really
Yeah.
interesting. Like, because so I, what, when you were saying what you were saying before and explaining your process with it, I really resonate with that, because what that leads to is true creativity. And you can use it as a tool for creativity, whether you're using it or not, it sounds like.
Mm.
Um, but it just opens you up to like your unlimited potential beyond how you perceive yourself, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that at least has happened in my life, and I imagine for most people, no matter where you live in the world, but especially Western societies, is that, we've been told a lot of things in our life, right? How to be, who to be, what to do for a living, don't do that because it's not, safe enough, right? And all these things. And so what these medicines do now, again, like, a lot of people look at the ego as like quote unquote the enemy, right? And I imagine we have a very similar view. And it's like, it's not the enemy, it's just a
No.
misguided entity, right? And
Yeah.
so, it wants to do the best with the information it has. But what happens at a certain point in our lives, specifically, for those of us that really get on a spiritual path, is that we realize that the way this thing was programmed is not lining up with how I want it to be anymore. And so, like, the way I think of it is like, it's almost like you're a pure soul and you get a computer. And so you go on the computer and you start just looking up random websites, and eventually you get some viruses because you have no idea that there's malicious people out there that want to put viruses on your computer. And not even malicious, right? Just people that are doing their own thing, right? That's how they make their money or whatever, right? And so then at a certain point you just keep lugging through thinking this is the way it is. And then someone around you says like, hey, for an example, like, your computer can go faster than that. And you're like, yeah, not mine though, because mine only goes as fast. They're like, no, dude, you got like 3 viruses on there. And you're like, what? And so this is like the self-discovery type thing you can do. Like, the friend in this situation is actually your higher self, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so with these plants, right, like Albert Einstein says, you can't solve a problem from the same level of thinking that created it. And so what these plants allow you to do is to hit the control alt delete buttons, right, and get out of the mind, go into the body, and rewrite some of this ego from when the ego is asleep. And what I've been able to do, and what I teach people to do in Connect with Cannabis, is like, get your ego on board with this, right? Because like a lot of people, like, especially men specifically, are like, kill your ego death. And it's like, listen,
It's not possible.
yeah, it's not possible. And if you think that part of you is the enemy so much that you want to kill part of yourself, yeah,
Right,
imagine, like,
right.
and then you go into a psychedelic experience with that type of energetic signature attached to you. Yeah, like, no wonder you're having terrible experiences and you're traumatized from them, right? So, the conversation I have with my ego these days is like, hey, you remember this last time? You looked way cooler on the other end of this, right? Like, like, we were able to stick way more to a structure that actually works for us, right? And the ego's like, yeah, okay. And so you're like, all right, I'm going to put you to bed for a little while, buddy. All right. But when you come back, you're going to be even better. Right. And so now, eventually the ego starts getting excited about my plant medicine experiences, because it's like, all right, yeah, we're going to lose the control thing, but it seems to be working pretty good. Like, even in our record, it seems to be working pretty cool, and we like looking cool, right? So, you know, and we like feeling ourselves. We like feeling, happy, right? And so
Yeah.
a lot of times it's really just like a dog that was with a family that didn't train it, or maybe it was trained to fight or something, and then you get the dog and you start teaching it love, right? And eventually that dog is the most loving, animal on the planet, right? And so it's really just rewiring how the brain works, specifically to talk about ego. But cannabis is the most amazing thing that can do this, because you don't need to go to a jungle. You don't need to take a week away from your life to do it. You don't necessarily need like, to go pay an expensive guy to do it, right? This is what we do in Connect with Cannabis. We teach people how to be a sovereign being, right? To be their own guide. And we also give them, different invocations and, different banishing spells and things like this, and different sigils to look at when they're not interacting with cannabis that represent cannabis and the healing powers of it, right? We do all these things that are very, psychological in effect, right? And at the same time, we empower them, right? Because like I, kind of hinted to in the beginning, like cannabis is the people's psychedelic, right? Like it's the psychedelic that you can do in your living room, right? It's a psychedelic that is also the least stigmatized. The one that, across this country anyway, is the one that you're least likely to get arrested for. The one that when you mention like, I interact with cannabis, or, the typical saying, I smoke weed, people are like, cool, whatever, right? But if you're like, I do mushrooms, people are like, yikes, right? Like even if they don't, even if, even now that the information's coming out from John Hopkins and with maps and everything, it's still very new. Cannabis is, it's been cushioning the blow for a little while. And so, because a lot of what gets people into challenging parts with their relationship with cannabis is like a lot of the stigma, right? Like, the classic, person smokes a joint in their bedroom and then is like, oh my God, what if my mom and dad show up? Oh my God, what if it's a cop outside the door, right? So nowadays it's really no big deal. And so that's why I say it's the people's psychedelic, because, it's a way that you can benefit from a lot of the same things you can get from ayahuasca, psilocybin, whatever. And also you only have to just cross the threshold, right? And that's again a big lesson we have in the science portion of the course with titrating doses, right? How to figure out how to dose yourself properly, right? Because the idea is there's different doses for everything, right? Again, there's no right or wrong, right? But if you're looking for the spiritual and transcendental properties, you only want to go just above the threshold, because you still want all your faculties pretty much still working,
That's what I do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like if you're looking for pain relief, then okay, yeah, do a heavier dose, right? If you have a high tolerance, okay, do a heavier dose, right? Like there's always, like differences between people's endocannabinoid systems, right? Like we imagine if neither of us had ever interacted with cannabis, right? And both of us were trying it at the same time, it might not get you any effect, right? Until you smoke 2 joints, right? And I might get an effect like that's like crazy psychedelic off the first hit. It depends on where our CB1 and CB2 receptors are. It depends on all these different aspects of our body. And so, it's really like, once again, it's like no one's got the user manual for this. And if you go to the typical dispensary, even if the people there are knowledgeable, and you're a first timer, you're going to walk in, you're going to see products everywhere with flashy colors. You're going to see names like Alaskan Thunderfuck on the menu. You're going to have rap music blaring, right? It's very overstimulating. And then you go in there, and at best you get good advice, right? But again, like the advice they're going to give you is like, oh well, this is what flower is, this is what concentrates are, this is what strain to start with, this is what THC means, right? They're not going to be like, like, do you do any inner work? Like, what's your spiritual practice like? Do you do anything like that, right? Like these questions are not asked, right?
Yeah,
And it's
that's
one of
true.
the reasons that I was looked at as such a challenging worker, because I would sit with someone for 2 hours and actually ask them these things, because I wanted them to leave and have a good experience. That's always my goal.
Yeah, that seems like the more responsible route for using cannabis, I think, or any other drugs, really,
Keeping it
But
real, keeping it safe.
yeah, yet we do it in more so party situations, right?
Mm,
And so it gets just our perception of it just gets shaped that way because that's what we're used to. That's what we grew up with, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we have a cute little there's so many cannabis places in Oregon and there's a cute little Hawaiian one down the street that I really like the
Oh,
experience
that's
of it
cool.
like every once in a while, but I can only go a very small percentage of THC because
Mm,
yeah, that's just how I'm so sensitive to it. So it works for me to be able to just like you said just subtly bring it in, you know,
yeah,
on occasion. And so that's how and it has been a really actually an incredible teacher for teaching me about, you know, like you said, the ego is really about, it's about training the ego. It's not about like trying to get rid of it. It's, you
yes,
know, hey, let's, we could have more fun here. Let's expand our horizons, with what we
Yeah.
can do. So that's the way I like to look at it too. There's a couple questions I wanted to also get into here is we talked a little bit about tobacco, and tobacco
Mm,
is pretty stigmatized, right, as like being something really terrible for you, or it's got that because of all the smoking and all the chemicals that are added
mm,
to cigarettes and everything for addiction and of course that's another thing that people use way too much of, right?
absolutely.
And kind of depend on it on a daily basis. um, what is your experience with tobacco plant medicine, and what have you learned from that?
Mm. Yeah, great question. When I was younger, like I mentioned at the beginning, I interacted with cigarettes, and I remember the addiction to them, right? Like it was almost what I imagine it would be like from, cases I've seen where people are addicted to heroin, right? I'm like scrounging couch cushions. I'm like, oh my God, like I need to find money to buy cigarettes, right? And then I quit, and didn't interact with any tobacco for over 10 years. It was from when I was like 18 to 28. I quit when I was 18, so it was pretty interesting. I smoked for like 2 years, but still in that time, it was very addicting. I luckily got out of it when I did, but when I got reintroduced to tobacco through a mutual friend of ours, Mr. Check, you know, I remember being like, "Oh, you smoke tobacco?" And he like looked at me and he's like, tobacco is not what is in cigarettes, right? And I was like, yeah. And it all started to happen. I was like, once again, I was like, yep, the conditioning is still there, right? Like where we see it happening with cannabis right now, too, right? Where cannabis, the spiritual plant, right, that's been used for thousands upon thousands of years, it's co-evolved with human beings, is now being bastardized, sprayed with pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, grown without love, and it's becoming essentially poison, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so the same thing is happening to tobacco, but it's just got like a 80-year head start, right? Or maybe even more, where, like they even look at the cigarettes that were out in the 50s, which were still carcinogenic, right? And smoking in general can definitely be carcinogenic, right? Which is one of the reasons that when I do choose to interact with tobacco, I'm vaporizing it. It's organic grown tobacco. And I'm really like, I'm tuning into the quote unquote woo woo of feeling the medicine when I interact with it and go, how does this feel in me? Does this feel like my body's like, no? Or does it feel like my body's like, oh, that's nice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's a big part of, how I interact with plant medicines and such. But, really you touched on dependency too. And this is something I want to bring out because, of course, if we're going to talk about tobacco, of course, nicotine can definitely be addicting, right? Even if it's organic tobacco. And it's something that, again, I seek to empower everyone to make their own decisions, right? And by no means does anyone need to interact with tobacco or cannabis to get, in touch with their spiritual self or redo their ego. But, it is a path, right? And so, for those that are curious, one of the things that, if you're looking to interact with these great powers, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And so it can oftentimes be really challenging to interact with plant medicines like tobacco and like cannabis too, because they are so easy to fall into patterns of dependency with. And
Mm-hmm.
people would call that addicting, right? And with cannabis more specifically, because nicotine does have a certain amount of physiological component of addiction, but really like, you know, cigarettes, tobacco, cannabis, these things, they're often looked at as just like, oh, those things are addicting. And it's like, are those things really addicting? Like past the point that, again, with tobacco has that small physiological addiction, or are feelings of comfort addicting for people that are hurting, right? Like, again, we start realizing, we start waking up and we start realizing that things don't feel good in our mind, right? They don't feel good in our experience of life. But we have no idea, right? Especially if we haven't started doing quote unquote the work yet. And so, we have no idea. And so what do we turn to? We turn to a protector, right? This can be food, this can be exercise, this can be literally pretty much anything. I mean, anything is able to become a pattern of dependency, right? And so with things like tobacco and cannabis, I always like telling people like, you know, it's more than likely what you're feeling the dependency to is something you're unconsciously running from. And so that's when, specifically with cannabis, but I imagine tobacco you could do this with too, start actually asking, be like, I know there's something I'm missing, I want to feel it, right? And
Oh,
strap
great.
in for that experience, like get your curiosity cap on and strap in, because those experiences can be really challenging, right? Because you're going to feel what you're most afraid of, right? And again, like, the caveat is that you'll feel it for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then it will be over, and potentially a lifetime of suffering for that particular issue will be gone. But it is scary. And so to go back to tobacco, the way in which I interact with it, is with the Volcano, like we were talking about. And I really watch myself on it, because I understand, I know myself enough to realize that, oh, I could totally wake up and hit a bag. I could, hit a bag 10 minutes later. I could be like, well, I mean, it's been another 8 minutes. I could hit another bag, right? Like these things are aware, but
Yeah.
I use it to I almost use it like chum in the water for sharks, right? If you don't think there's sharks, throw chum in the water and you will find sharks, depending on where you are in the world anyway. And so for me, I interact with these things to almost like check myself, right? So like if I'm interacting with something like tobacco, right? And all of a sudden I notice one day like, ooh, I'm craving this way too early. What's going on? What am I not seeing, right? And so I won't be naive enough to interact with tobacco and just numb it out, because I've done that plenty of times in the past. As we talked about, I did it with cannabis too. So I know that pattern, right? And so I'm careful to never fall into naivety or naivety, yeah, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
plural of that word is, words are hard, but
Naivety?
yeah,
Naivety?
naivety. Thank you. I knew it was one or the other, but I'm careful to not fall into that, because I know myself, and I know that like there are still things, like I'm a process, not an outcome, right? It's not like you figure out your issues and you're like, great, I'm done. It's like, no, there's, as Mark says, there's levels to this shit, right? And so, for me, I almost use it like chum in the water, right? Where, I know when it works really good for me, like when I'm on a podcast and I want to keep myself grounded, because
Mm.
sometimes I can go out to the outer planes. It helps me stay focused. When I'm working really hard on like what I'm doing now with the science materials, and I'm working like 12 hours in front of a computer, it can help me once again stay grounded and not be like, oh, let me get up and do this. Let me go do this. Let me, in distraction central. So I also know that like if it's a Saturday morning and I wake up with Rachel and I have no work on the agenda and it's a relaxing day, and immediately my body goes, better make a bag. I'm like, ooh, there's something there. What's there? Right. And so I use it, as that daily check-in to be like, okay, how am I doing? Is there something I'm looking to be aware of? Is there a lesson waiting to be learned on the other side of this, dependent protector pattern?
That is so good. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's that deeper awareness around what we're doing, like that, not really labeling anything as bad or good so much, but like how you're using it, right? And that really
Exactly.
does apply to everything in your life,
Mm,
you know? Applies
absolutely.
to relationships, or applies to, like you said, exercise, food, um, yeah, I mean, everything. How you're experiencing other people, how you want everybody to experience you. Yeah, and so and alcohol as well. I would say I put that in that category too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but even like I've even seen people do it with like a healthy, like a health perspective, like health food, like even going so far as to being so restrictive about stuff, and it's like like I've seen it in all forms. So I know
Yeah.
that what you're talking about, like that makes so much sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Really, it's like, it happens with everything. It's just that certain things are more socially acceptable to become dependent on, right? Like coffee,
Yeah.
right? Like how many people do it with coffee? Oh, it's my fifth cup of coffee, right? If someone said this is my fifth joint of the day or my fifth drink of the day at, 10 or 11 a.m., people would be like, their friends would be like, hey, man, you have a problem, right? But because coffee, if you really want to look into like this random example of like what coffee represents, which is productivity, which is really highly admired in our society, especially with consumerism and capitalism, it's aka not a bad thing, quote unquote, right?
Mm-hmm.
When
Right.
it
Right.
comes, yeah, it comes to exercise, right? Like Paul's one of the only people, I mean, there's much more people talking about it now, but Paul was one of the first people I heard be like, yeah, you people that are doing 2 a days and being like, oh, I'm in the gym more than you. Yeah, because you're hiding something from yourself. In most cases, like there is a time, of course, you're training for a competition, whatever. But if you're in the gym twice, 3 times a day and you're getting injuries and you're getting tendinitises and things like this, and you're still pushing past that, if you don't think that's a pattern of dependency, you are being naive.
Yeah.
There's something there.
I call it distracting yourself from yourself, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I was a master at it, and
Yeah.
it's
Me
still,
too. Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's amazing, like the things that the mind will allow us to fall into. And again, the ego thinks it's doing the right thing. It's like, we don't want you to feel that. We want you to feel good. But it's like, no, the good is actually behind the bad, because bliss is any emotion felt all the way through. So it's this
Yeah.
whole, it really rests on like what emotional states are deemed desirable and undesirable in society. That's one of the first programs we have put on us, is that like, hey, if you're crying, you're too much. But if you're laughing, all more of that, right? Or if you're happy, that's amazing. If you're sad, oh darn, that stinks. I can't wait for you to feel happy again, right? When really
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, what you start realizing, especially in plant medicine ceremonies, is like some of the best times are when you're puking and crying. So it's like, what does that mean?
Well, and I think positivity and happiness can be great when it's coming from an authentic place, right? And
Yes.
it's like if you suppress the feelings, and this is from my experience, really, it's not going anywhere. It's still in there somewhere, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
going to come out eventually. So you might as well feel it and let it move through, right? And sometimes it's really scary. It can be scary at first, but when you start to begin to um make that a practice, it's really, it just kind of moves right through, and then you don't have to like because you're right, like when people are keeping themselves really busy all the time, you can feel the energy of that. That's like they're really trying to push some part of themselves away and not
Hmm.
face it, right?
Yes.
And it's like you can see it, you can feel it with people, and it's a very uncomfortable place to be from my experience, and it's a form of suffering in some respects, right?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
like, how many of us like sitting in traffic, right? Like, probably not many, right? And, at the same time, how many of us by numbing ourselves out, right? And I was one of these people. I still find myself in patterns of it today, right? We're all works in progress, right? But, you know, how many times have we pushed things aside and not correlated it to essentially creating a traffic jam in our minds, bodies, and spirits, right? And so then we're like, oh, feeling this. Oh, and I wake up, oh, I'm heavy. Better go do something, right? And that's like adding more cars to the traffic jam and expecting traffic to be less, right? It's like it doesn't make any sense. What is taken or what is needed in that situation is to subtract cars, and that's why daily rituals are such a big thing in pretty much every spiritual practice, and the specific ones they do. Like, it's funny how I was talking to Bill Burnett about this, because he's a breath work extraordinaire. And he's talking about like, yeah, breath work's becoming a thing, but look at the styles that are the most popular. It's like Wim Hof, like these really
Yes.
intense upregulatory styles. And there's nothing against those, but like, do most people actually need to be more upregulated, right? Like,
Yeah.
or are they just like redlining their nervous system once again? I mean, it's really interesting to watch these things, but yes, subtraction is necessary.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I've noticed that too. With again, nothing against Wim Hof, but I just knew it
Yeah.
wasn't for me because it was adrenalizing, and I
Yeah.
didn't need any more adrenaline. I was like,
Yeah.
so I started, so I started really connecting with my breath through sound, voice, singing, those kind of things, because I just felt more like harmonizing to my energy and my body,
Mm.
and and more creative too, So I've got my own way of approaching that. But yeah, I mean, I agree that is an interesting perspective. I never, but yeah, it seems like we try to pile on more to do when we feel like something is off, instead of just stepping back and being and seeing, what needs to be taken away. Really, is what it comes down to a lot of times, right?
Yeah, I mean, we are human beings at the end of the day, not human doings, right? And I have to remind myself that, because like there'll be
Uh,
times where I'm doing it and I'm like,
yeah,
hey,
exactly.
do you need to do 5 podcasts in one day? Like, do you absolutely need to, right? Or is this just like, and it's not that, I won't do 5 in a day, right? It's like, okay, if this is getting stressful beyond the point of no return, like I have to actually ask myself, like, do you need to do these today, right? And in most cases, it's no, right? So
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
okay, so is it worth the stress you're getting? Right. It's like, no. All right. Then reach out to the people, tell them that, hey, you're a human being and you scheduled too many podcasts and you're going to reschedule them. And in most cases, they're like, oh, I know exactly what you mean. I do the same thing all the time. And so a lot of times when we are vulnerable like that, and allow people to realize like, hey, I'm a little overstressed right now, it immediately acts as a permission slip for what they need to say, right? I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
this is one of the best gifts we can give one another, is the vulnerability, specifically around, doing and, doing too much and being too overstimulated, like, but also just in general, right? Like, we are the heroes we've been waiting for, right? For ourselves and for others. And, I think that, we watch so many hero movies that we forget that, like, yes, what they do is amazing. Like, Batman's incredible, right? But,
Right.
we can do that in our daily lives. We can act as that superhero without necessarily having to put on a cape and do these things, right? And so, one of the best ways I found is just like being honest with myself and others when I'm like, hey, I did that thing again where I put too much on my plate. Sorry, but I want to show up with full presence, and I really don't have it right now. And they're
Yeah.
like, oh, perfect. I'm doing the same thing right now. And you just gave me permission to reschedule something in my day. Right. So,
Yeah, I would say 100% of the time it works out. I mean, maybe not 100%, somewhere in that range, but
60% of the time it works every time.
yeah.
I always got to pull that Anchorman quote.
Somebody said to me the other day, it was like, when has it not ever worked out? Like thinking to
Yeah.
myself,
You're
well,
still alive, right?
actually, I think it's always worked out. So let's just go
Yeah.
with that, right?
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, Ryan. And we're coming up on the hour, but I would really love for you just to say a little bit about the volcano too, for those people who really don't know
Yes.
what that is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so. I feel like I've been waiting for this question my entire life. so, uh, so let me tell you a little story about the volcano. So,
Okay.
back in 2008 or 2009, my uncle was diagnosed with cancer, and so my uncle was a wild child. He was a bachelor his whole life, never had kids, and so he comes over. And the volcanoes at this point were like $800 or $900. They were really expensive.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he's like, I want to get into vaporizing. Like, what do you think I should get? I'm like, well, the volcano's basically buy it. I'm like, this is like, he's like, buy it. I'm like, you sure you're going to like it? He's like, just get it. So we get it in the mail. He tries it. He's like, I hate it. Right. Because he was just a smoker. And he was already having some experience or some challenges with cancer and couldn't really figure it out. So he just gives it to my dad. And so I'm like, Dad, you're not going to use that, right? This is like, yeah, 2009, 2010. And I'm like, you're not going to use it, right? And at this time, this is like, I mean, for an 18-year-old at this time who was into cannabis to get a volcano, I felt like God had just graced me. I was like, oh my God, because there was no way I was going to spend $900 when I could barely afford food to get a volcano. So I get this volcano. I tried for a while. I liked it, but I didn't really, at that time, it didn't land with me. I was still smoking blunts. I was still, just doing other stuff. So it literally sat on my shelf for like the next 8 or 9 years, like,
Oh
or more
wow.
even. And so it wasn't until, of course, I started seeing Paul use it. And it was about 2 years before I quit my dispensary job that I started. It just got a ping one day. I want to get into vaporizing, so I bought this little tiny handheld vaporizer that worked well, and then I upgraded to the Mighty, which is the handheld one from the same company that creates the Volcano, Stores and Bickle. And so I started using it, loved it. That was the only way I interacted with cannabis, and at that time I wasn't interacting with tobacco. So I go to that first trip at Mark England's lake house, and Danny Rios is there, and he's got the volcano. And I'm like, that's weird. I haven't seen one of those things in forever. I have one of those on my shelf. We start hitting it, and I fall in love that weekend. Like, I straight up fell in love, and I was like, wow. And then every single retreat and everything I went to, everyone had volcanoes. And I was like, okay, apparently this is like one of those
Notice that too.
reticular, yeah, it's like one of those reticular activating systems. I'm like, okay, like things where you start seeing it and then you see it everywhere. And then, Bloodso's telling me about how Paul's got like 10 of them around his house. So basically what the volcano is it's a German made vaporizer. And these things are built like tanks. Mine is literally, 2008, 2009, and now like 12 years old, still works amazing. Like,
Wow.
and it's incredible. I just made a bag before this episode, right? So, the evidence is there, right? And so, what it does is a vaporizer, as opposed to combusting any type of plant material, that is when you get a lot of the carcinogens, right? Even with cannabis, right? There are challenging things that can irritate your bronchioles, your bronchial tubes. There's things that can, irritate your alveoli, which I believe are the strands on the inside of your lungs. I could have got that wrong, but or
Little
violi maybe.
sacks, the little
Yeah,
sacks.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so basically when you're vaporizing, you're just heating it enough to remove the constituents. With cannabis, it'd be like the cannabinoids, without actually combusting it. Now, the really cool thing
Oh,
is that, say if you're someone who's like, well, I only want THC, I only want, THC and CBD, right? There's this whole list online you can find of different combustion points of different constituents of the cannabis plant. So you can actually kind of tailor your experience based off of what temperature you put this volcano to. So they have an analog one, which is kind of like what Paul uses. The advantage to the analog one, if anyone wants the skinny on it, is that it won't turn off automatically. And it gets frustrating when you're at a party and like the old digital, which I have, takes forever to heat up. And so if it turns off every like 10 minutes. So like if you forget about it, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I gotta wait a whole 5 minutes to hit this bag, right? So
that's so long.
yeah, so long, first world problems for sure. And so they have the analog, they have the old digital. Now they just came out with a hybrid, which is amazing. It's a digital that heats up in 3 seconds, basically. It's amazing. And so you can interact with any different kind of herb in there. You can put essential oils on there. I love Dr. Nick Berry's essential oils, the essential oil wizard. And it's the superior way to interact with any type of herb, but especially cannabis, I find, because for me, I could be looked at as a cannabis quote unquote snob, right? So I really enjoy the flavor, the taste profiles. I'm like one of those wine guys who's like, ooh, I smell this, right? So with smoking, yeah, you get a little bit of the terpenes right off the bat, but then it just all gets mudded over with the taste of smoke and tar. And so with the volcano, you can really taste that so long as you have a new enough bag for the entire experience. And a huge part of, like, let's just use cannabis for example, of the experience is the olfactory system, right? It's the smell, it's the taste, it's everything, right? So you get more of a quote unquote full spectrum experience with the volcano. So that's a little summary of what the volcano is. I'm a huge fan of it. It's a registered medical device in Germany for people that are interacting with medical cannabis. I mean, this thing is the real deal. It is the best on the market, hands down. I got to get him as a sponsor because I talk about him all the time.
I love mine.
Yes.
It's the best thing I ever purchased, really.
Oh my goodness.
And it just is a better way to get some herbs in. I mean, you can use any herb really, and things out of your backyard. I've dried herbs from my backyard and put it in there. It's like amazing. Sage is one of those things. Like, it's really nice. But so okay, cool. This has been amazing.
This is amazing.
It's so great. I've learned so many things and just gotten such a great perspective on all this. And this is kind of the show I've been waiting for. So thanks, Ryan, for coming on.
Likewise.
This was incredible.
Yes.
Please leave everybody, my listeners, and with information about you, how to find you, how to sign up for your cannabis program. As well. Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at the real Ryan Sprague. There were some fakes out there, so I had to make sure people knew what it was. Really?
So wow. Guilty as charged, So no, there's some other Ryan Spragues out there. I've yet to meet them, but I had to make sure that people knew it was the real Ryan Sprague, as opposed to the fake ones. But at the real Ryan Sprague is my personal profile. And then if you want to hop on to Highly Optimized, it's at highly.optimized. We do a really good job of posting like as much free content as possible in there to do with cannabis. So if you're someone who is interested in the way I spoke about cannabis in this episode, hop on there and you can learn a bunch just from what we posted for free. And you can really try a bunch of new things out and just, try these things out and have the direct experience yourself and see if it works for you. And then for those that are looking to go deeper into the rabbit hole of cannabis and really, apprentice with this plant and become initiated into, really like the first conscious cannabis movement I've ever heard of in the modern day. We do host a 8-week group coaching program called Connect with Cannabis, where we teach people how to coach either themselves or their clients with cannabis, right? And so we teach you how to speak and understand the language that cannabis speaks in. And we also give you that long lost user manual. It's super fun. We have the most fun homework on the internet. We guarantee it. And, we're really excited. This is our 3rd group going through right now. And people are having mind-blowing and heart-opening experiences on the first week, right? And so I'm really excited and I'm really grateful, for you having me on, for cannabis allowing me to have this beautiful co-creative relationship that has gone from a pattern of dependency to a power couple dynamic, and now being able to capture it as well as I can with words and put it into the physical plane with Connect with Cannabis. It's just been such a gift. I mean, I got to pinch myself
Ah,
to, remind myself I'm not dreaming.
it's amazing what you're offering.
Yeah,
Like that's just
thank
unheard
you.
of. Nobody that I know is doing that. It's great. Just
Yeah,
like helping you build a relationship with plant medicine, with
yeah,
cannabis. It's just like incredible. If
yeah.
I wish I had had this sooner, but it's here now. Um,
Yeah.
also, you have some podcasts too. You have two
Yes.
podcasts or three? Like two?
Yes,
Okay.
too.
Okay.
It's funny, like people often ask, like, when are you gonna start a third one? I'm like, listen, I am the crazy person that will do that because I love talking. I'm a projector in human design, but I have two as of right now. Highly Optimized is my first one, my first baby child of the podcasting world. And my best advice is if you're looking for like inspiration or tools and tips on how to like go off on your own, start an entrepreneurial journey, become a conscious leader, really like quantifiable things of like, people that have done this themselves, that's the podcast for you. On the other hand, if you like jumping down the rabbit hole and exploring all of life's deepest mysteries and really learning a lot about plant medicines, hearing about people's, really subjective experiences with it, their tips, their pieces of advice, everything, then the vehicle for you is this one time on psychedelics. And one thing I wanted to mention too is that I realized that thinking about cannabis these days is really different, right? And so for anyone who's interested, like, but is like, I don't know if it's right for me, but like, it sounds interesting, reach out to me. Like, I'll hop on a free call with you and I'll show you exactly what I mean with this. I'll get you to have the direct experience of it because there's only so much I can say in words. When it's applied to your own life, you actually allow it to make sense in whatever way it is going to make sense to you. So for anyone that's curious, just reach out to me. I'm happy to hop on a call with you and give you the direct experience of what Connect with Cannabis is. So yeah,
Wonderful. Thank you, Ryan. This has been incredible. Thanks so much for
absolutely.
coming on, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, thank you.